Just gone 3 o'clock. I'm Tim Diamond. Good afternoon. Boris Johnson pledging a further £1 billion of military support for Ukraine to be spent on helping the Ukrainians tackle the threat from the Russians, the ongoing threat from Russia. He said, indeed, at the NATO conference in Madrid, we need to invest for the long term in vital capabilities like future combat air, whilst simultaneously adapting to a more dangerous and more competitive world. The logistical conclusion of the investments on which we propose to embark these decisions is it will reach 2.5% of GDP on defence by the end of the decade. Let's bring in and speak live to Dr. Peter Caddick-Adams, who's a former NATO historian and defence expert. Good afternoon to you and thanks for your time.
Hello, Jim.
So we've heard what Boris Johnson is outlining, but the Defence Secretary is lobbying for an increase in spending, and the senior Tory MP, Tobias Ellwood, who's chair of the Commons Defence Committee, has said this is not the time to cut the army by 10,000, and moving to 2.5% defence spend by 2030 is too little, too late. Are they right? Who's right?
They're absolutely right. This is a prime ministerial fudge. So let's take the number of troops first. The army's in the mid-80s, and the proposal before the Ukraine crisis kicked off was to reduce the army in terms of mostly infantry numbers down to 72,500. I'd have thought the international sort of scene, certainly in Europe, would indicate we need more people rather than less. And so now is hardly the time to be going through with cutting numbers. But in terms of the overall defence budget, Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, was arguing for 2.5% now, as Tobias Ellwood and other MPs have been doing. And to say 2.5% at the end of the decade, when we're only at the beginning of the decade, and we have a really serious war almost on our doorstep, but certainly on the fringes of Europe, is just inappropriate. Boris Johnson won't be in power at the end of the decade, and what he's done is just sort of, unfortunately, just shunted this down the road.
Well, NATO's chief is saying members have agreed a significant increase in funding for the alliance itself on the second day of the summit in Madrid. Does that make a difference, at least, that there is unity from the NATO alliance, and put together we are talking quite large sums of money?
Yeah, I mean, there's recognition right across the alliance that more money needs to be forthcoming, if only to replace all the military equipment and investment that's now being sent to Ukraine. NATO's strategy is not to confront Russia directly, but to prop up Ukraine and at least ensure that Ukraine won't lose. Because if it did, then that would bring Russia right onto NATO's doorstep, and a sort of empowered Russia might then feel it could sort of cross the red line. So that's what's going on there, and that's good news, as is the arrival of Sweden and Finland as part of the NATO alliance.
Yes, although member states will need to ratify it, is there likely to be any bumps in the road or a blockage to that?
The big bump was Turkey, which was really just flexing its muscles because it could, a NATO member who had objections about Kurdish separatists who were based particularly in Sweden. But those were ironed out at the beginning of the summit, which came as a big surprise. And what Jens Stoltenberg said is that those two countries may arrive formally in NATO within something as quick as 2 weeks. And we're all raising our eyebrows and thinking, goodness me, it is possible to fast forward these things through. They're both very advanced nations who put a lot in defence. And that's why NATO is keen to have them.
Russia's forces have left the strategic outcrop Snake Island in the northwestern Black Sea, which has been fought over since the start of the war. Ukraine see the retreat as a victory. Russia say giving up the island is a goodwill gesture. Who do you think's calling this one?
Well, quite clearly, I mean, NATO has got Ukraine's view is probably the right one and just sort of sitting impartially in the wings. Russia has been using that island to interdict Ukraine's coastline, but also to stop all those grain shipments, and has realized that also it's not powerful enough to hold the island. And Ukraine has effectively pushed the Russians off with its longer range missiles. So it's not a goodwill gesture from the Russians. They've actually been defeated there, and they're trying to cloak a defeat by saying it's a goodwill gesture. But it's certainly a significant development.
And finally, Vladimir Putin is accusing NATO of having imperial ambitions. Is there a touch of irony in that?
Yeah, I mean, totally, isn't it? Amazing. I mean, he started off with an invasion of his own, which is certainly a version of imperial ambitions. And the response he's triggered is European unity, NATO unity, and two countries joining NATO, making it more powerful than it ever was before. So he's got exactly the opposite result of what he wants. I think the distressing thing is he's sticking to the script. There's no indication of sort of pullback at all or alteration of strategy. They're in it for the long term, and therefore, this is why the summit's so important. NATO has to be as well. This is a war, I'm afraid, that you and I may be having this discussion about Ukraine in a year's time.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Peter Caddick-Adams, former NATO historian and defence expert.